Psychosexual stages, which is a very important conceptual part in Freud. Psychosexual stages is a very important Freud part in Freudian edifice. Uh, One of the cardinal principles in psychoanalysis is the primacy of childhood, which says that what happens in the first 5 years of life is unusually important for pathogenesis and for healing. And therefore the question arises, what happens in the first 5 years of life? And every psychologist who is interested in childhood determination of pathology, Freud, Jung, Adler, Kohut, Winnicott, each of them has tried to describe, Melanie Klein, very importantly, I forgot. Each of them has elaborately explained what happens in childhood which is responsible for pathology that we see in the adult life. If we say the first 5 years are most important, then what happens in those first 5 years? Each founder of a psychoanalytic school gives us a different idea on what is most important that happens in the first 5 years. Freud's account of what happens in the first 5 years is titled Psychosexual Stages. It is under this title Freud talks about how the development happens in the childhood, and in development, if something goes wrong at particular time periods, what are the outcomes for the adult mind or for the child mind itself if it is very severe. So psychosexual stages are a very important part of Freudian school. In fact, they are the center of the Freudian school. So let us first look at why do you call the developmental stages of first 5 years as psychosexual stages, and how Freud looks at this journey. And very importantly, what are the constituents of this developmental period and what constitutes what we call the psychosexual stages. What are the psychosexual stages? We start with human childhood. Human childhood is unusually long, helpless and dependent. If we look at the way childhood is in most species, mammalian and non-mammalian, we don't find childhood which is as long, as helpless and as dependent as a human childhood is in most of the species. In most species, the childhood is short. The child very soon becomes capable of taking care of himself, and the dependency is neither so long nor so deep. But human childhood is unusually long, unusually helpless and unusually deep, unusually dependent. We are extremely dependent, helpless species in our childhood. Now, Second important element of childhood is what is learned in the childhood is very strongly stored in the mind. Why this is so, we don't clearly know, but it is very clear that in the childhood period, we are creating the basic building blocks of our thinking. Receptivity is very high. Affect which is felt is unattenuated, it is felt in full measure. Defenses are not as developed as they are in adulthood. Experience to manage affect is very less. Reality testing is still not fully developed. Ability to differentiate fantasy and reality also is not fully developed. And in that situation where the receptivity is very high, sensitivity is very high, affect generation is very high, ability to regulate affect is very low, ability to rationally reflect on something is very low. In such a stage, learning which happens in childhood is huge in volume. It creates the fundamental templates which govern the way we think in adult life, and the affect which is generated, and that part of affect generated which cannot be regulated is repressed or which creates a symptom. That affect generation is very high and very difficult to regulate successfully. So in such a situation, the first 5 years of life become very important because the core templates, the core building blocks of personality are created in those first 5 years, and there lie the root of pathology, and there also lies the secret of healing. What happens in the first 5 years is a subject for psychology to study, and every school of psychology, be it psychoanalysis or outside of psychoanalysis, they all talk of developmental stages. In fact, it's a specialization in psychology. It is called developmental psychology. And this developmental psychology is approached in many ways, because in the first 5 years, there are many lines of development which happen. What we call development is actually, if you deconstruct it into finer constituents, there are many lines of development which come together to create this whole process of development. So there is a cognitive line of development. There is a biological line of development. There is a linguistic line of development. And there is an affective line of development. And this affective line of development can be further divided into a Freudian line of development, a Kleinian line of development, a Cohusian line of development, a Winnicottian line of development, a Navanlu's line of development, a Margaret Mahler's line of development. So all of them have pointed out to some phenomena which are largely affective in nature and happen in the first 5 years of life. And all of this constitutes what we call the affective line of development. So when Freud talks about the developmental period of the first 5 years, he talks from the point of view of affective development. And in that zone of affective development, his line is one line of development. It is not that what he says is the only thing that happens. So what Freud describes as stages of development, which he calls psychosexual stages, that is a one line of event which happens. Similarly, there are many other lines of events which happen within the affective zone. And similarly, there are multiple lines in the cognitive zone, multiple lines in the biological zone, multiple lines in the neurological zone, multiple lines in the linguistic zone. And all these lines, they come together to create what we call this whole process of development. So with this background, let us come to why Freud calls these developmental stages as psychosexual stages. Freud uses two words, psycho and sexual. Psycho because he is not focusing on the development of bones or development of immune system or development of skin or anything of that type. He is focusing only on the psychological part, and within the psychological part only on the affective part. And therefore he uses the word psycho to give a clear direction on what his developmental elaboration is focused upon. Second, he uses the word sexual, and by that he does not mean the sexual act. He uses the word sexual in a broader sense, and when Freud uses the word sexual, he generally refers to the original word eros. So eros is the original word which denotes pleasure in the broad sense of the term. So when Freud says psychosexual stage, he refers to psychological stages with pleasure at the center of that stage. So Freud's description of a stage has pleasure at its center, and therefore Freud calls it psychosexual stage. An affective stage with the effect of pleasure at its center, and that stage Freud calls as a psychosexual stage. And before going to the psychosexual journey, Freud describes an erotogenic zone. So eros, as we said. So when he says sexual, he means erotic, and erotic meaning eros meaning pleasurable. It's a broad use of the meaning of the word sexual, which is equivalent of eros and pleasure. So Freud says, in early childhood from 0 to 5 years of age, and that is the main focus of Freud's psychosexual stages. So Freud focuses on 0 to 5 years of age. Now this is a difference. Klein focuses primarily on 0 to 3 years. Jung focuses lifelong because Jung's program of life is unfolding over a lifetime. Erik Erikson focuses lifelong. His stages cover the whole of life. But Freud, Klein, beyond, they focus largely on the early part of life. Jung also focuses on the early part of life more than other parts of life, but the unfolding happens over a lifetime. So Freud focuses essentially in the age 0 to 5 years. And it is in this period that most critical psychological events happen, largely in the unconscious mind, which then determine the structure of the personality, pathology, health, and allow us a route towards healing. So Freud starts with the erotogenic zone. Freud says, in the period of 0 to 5 years, the parts of the body which are primarily used to experience pleasure, where the pleasure activity is centered, those parts keep changing from 0 to 5 years of age. So initially, in the first few days, the whole body may be an erotic instrument, in the sense pleasure can be felt by stimulating any part of the body. The libido is spread all over the body. But very soon, the oral stage starts. So in 0 to 2 years, the pleasure experienced by the child is largely through the oral cavity, the mouth part, the lip part. And this lip and the mouth apparatus, the oral apparatus, is where most of the pleasure is derived from. So Freud says, similarly, parts of the body from which pleasure is largely derived from, pleasure activity is largely concentrated, those parts, they keep changing from in the period of 0 to 5. And these parts are termed by Freud as erotogenic zones. So what are erotomanic zones? The idea is that the entire body is not equally capable of experiencing or concentrating pleasure activity. Some parts of the body are more capable than others to experience pleasure. There is a concentration of pleasure activity in certain parts of the body. For example, the lip and the oral part is more capable than this part. The sexual organ part will be more capable than this part in experiencing pleasure. So this part also can experience pleasure of touch. This part also can experience pleasure of touch, but this has larger capacity to experience the pleasure of touch or tactile pleasure. So Freud says that there are concentration of nerves to experience pleasure in certain parts of the body more than other parts of the body. So certain parts of the body have higher capacity because of whatever be the biological situation behind it, that certain parts of the body have more capacity to enjoy pleasure, and in those parts pleasure activity is more concentrated. Those parts are called as erotogenic zones. So what are the erotogenic zones? The oral part, the sexual organs, and the anal part. These, according to Freud, are very important erotogenic zones where the pleasure activity is concentrated at different times in the period of 0 to 5. So the oral apparatus, the anal apparatus, and the sexual organ apparatus, they are termed as erotogenic zones by Freud. So what is a psychosexual journey? Psychosexual journey is the journey from one erotogenic zone to another in the period of 0 to 5 years according to a biologically predetermined program. This is not something which a child decides or the parents decide. This is something which happens naturally because of the way our hardware is. It's inbuilt into our hardware. So, psychosexual stages are the stages that one passes through in the period of 0 to 5 years, and in each psychosexual stage, a different erotogenic zone is the focus of experience. And in each psychosexual stage, different experiences are important. And in each psychosexual stage, if something goes wrong, a particular pathology can develop. So each psychosexual stage is different from the other. And the chronology of this stage, one follows the other, is biologically determined. So this is the psychosexual journey from 0 to 5 years of age. It is a journey through psychosexual stages where in each psychosexual stage, a different erotogenic zone is the center of concentrated pleasure activity. One very important point, too much pleasure or too little pleasure in any stage leads to fixation or any sort of psychopathology rooted in that stage. So we have to be gratified adequately and we have to feel optimum frustration. Too much of gratification, too much of frustration leads to fixation or becomes the root of some pathology or the other. With this background, let us now look at what are the psychosexual stages, what are the names given to each stage by Freud, and at what part of childhood these stages make an appearance. So, if we look at most of the books on Freud, they talk of only 3 stages. They talk of 3 psychosexual stages. The oral stage from 0 to 2 years. Anal stage from 2 to 3.5 years. Some people write down 2 to 4 years. Phallic or the Oedipal stage, some people say 4 to 5 years. Some people say 3.5 to 5 years. Some people say 4 to 7 years. But we can indicatively take oral stage to be 0 to 2 years, anal stage 2 to 4 years, phallic stage or the Oedipal stage, either of the word is used for this stage, 4 to 5 years. So most books describe only these three stages which are in green color: oral stage, anal stage, phallic or Oedipal stage. But if you go into details of Freud, you will find one stage, primary narcissism, which is before the oral stage, then latency stage after the Oedipal stage, and the genital stage. So if we want a full survey of Freud's psychosexual stages, we will have to go into 6 stages. So let us look at each of them. First stage is the stage of primary narcissism. Freud says in the first few days or weeks, we don't have a concept of I and not I. Let me just put the details here. I hope this is clear that most books talk about these 3 stages in green, but if we want a full survey, we go into all the 6 stages. Let us go into them one by one and see what are the stages, what each stage is about, and if something goes wrong in any stage, how does it lead to pathology. So before we go there, let me just finish up the primary narcissism. Freud says in the first few days, the child lives in one oceanic hole. There is no concept of I and not I. The child does not have a concept of I and not I. He just feels there is one oceanic whole. It's an oceanic experience. And this stage is the stage of primary narcissism. It is a pre-object stage. There is no object in this stage. This is just one oceanic whole. On this point, Klein is completely opposed to Freud. Kleinians believe that there is nothing like a pre-object stage. We are essentially object seekers by birth, and the idea of relating to an object is there by birth. There is no period of life where we don't have an idea of an object. But Freud believes that there is such a stage, a pre-object stage, where one experiences an oceanic whole. Recent studies point more towards Klein that she is right rather than Freud. However, I don't agree with those studies. I believe the stage of primary narcissism is a real stage. What may happen is it may not be a stage. It may be a state that one enters into for some period of time. But the experience of an object-free state and experience in rare situations of an oceanic whole are very real experiences, proven again and again by a large number of people. So it may be that we may not have a pre-object stage for 2 weeks and then the object stage starts. It may be that the object stage may start from birth, but in between that object stage, in between there are periods where one experiences an oceanic whole and an object-free condition. So that may be one way out if we have to reconcile the fact of primary narcissism with the empirical findings of child research in recent times. That may be one way out, or it may be that we do have a stage of primary narcissism where occasionally there may be object recognition, but largely it is a object free stage. Future will tell us what is the truth, but the experience of primary narcissism is not in question at all. Whether it is a temporal state or a distinct stage, that remains to be established. In this stage of primary narcissism, there is a feeling of bliss, there is a feeling of omnipotence, there is a feeling of ecstasy, there is a feeling of a splendor. Occasionally, there is also a feeling of unattenuated terror, unattenuated guilt, unattenuated envy. But most of the times, there is a feeling of bliss, at times reverie, at times omnipotence, at times fulfillment and completeness, at times the feeling of being one rounded organic whole. People confuse the state of primary narcissism, particularly Freudians, with the spiritual state of enlightenment. Commonality being, in spiritual state of enlightenment also, there is an experience of oneness with everything. There is an oceanic experience, there is a bliss, there is freedom from the object. What they forget is the state of enlightenment is a post-object state which is achieved after long years of effort, of inner work, whereas primary narcissism is a pre-object stage. So there is a pre-object stage, there is a normal object stage, and there is a stage of enlightenment which is a post-object stage. And after the state of enlightenment, one actually has a choice to be in an object stage or to be in a post-object enlightened state. In primary narcissism, we don't have a choice of not going into the object stage. The biology will force us to, at a point in time, give up the state of primary narcissism of being object free and get into an object stage. So the primary narcissism is a stage, it's an alpha at the beginning, and the enlightenment is the end, omega. So there are two ends of the continuum. One where you start the journey, second where you end the journey. They are not the same, they are completely different, although they share some common characteristics. So there is this stage of primary narcissism. If the stage of primary narcissism or the state of primary narcissism, if one does not believe in the stage, has been felt very intensely, and the bliss, the carefree nature, the self-sufficient, self-fulfillment providing state, where everything happens as one wants to happen without even asking for it to happen. The state of bliss, fulfillment, completion, one organic whole. If the pleasure in that state is too high, often a fixation can happen there, and in adult life one comes back to this stage with features of negative features of psychosis. So in some cases of negative features of psychosis, there are two different categories in negative features of psychosis. So you can divide psychosis into two: psychosis with positive features, psychosis with negative features, and the negative features again you can divide into two: psychosis with negative features without happiness and bliss being the primary affective feature, and psychosis with negative features where some unpleasant emotion is the primary feature of the affective life. So in that group where happiness and bliss is high, even though the person is psychotic, that is because the person has regressed and is fixated in the state of primary narcissism. And the pleasure and the bliss of primary narcissism is so intoxicating, the person just doesn't want to come out of it and get into the world of object relations where you have to encounter reality, risk, uncertainty, failure, hurt, and negative effects. So this too much of gratification can lead to the state of primary narcissism. Can lead too much of gratification in the state of primary narcissism can lead to one particular group of psychosis that we refer to. Too little experience of this bliss can lead to a person not developing a taste for bliss, reverie. So the person would have underdeveloped spiritual life, underdeveloped artistic life, and would seek very strong stimulants, mostly pathological or addictive, and the person can easily go to sadism or masochism because the person just doesn't have experience of going back to the state of bliss, experiencing that orgasmic bliss, experiencing that pleasant, intensely pleasant thing, rejuvenating, refreshing thing, and then coming back to the state of object relations. When we take a vacation, we essentially try to go back to the state of primary narcissism in some measure to experience that state of reverie, the state of bliss and happiness, the state of carefree nature, the state of oneness as much as we can, get ourselves refreshed, rejuvenated. And then we come back to the state of object relations because the state of object relations is demanding, taxing, and difficult to bear. So we all need a vacation, we all need a break. We all need a break to have a cup of tea where we try to go back to the state of primary narcissism, rejuvenate ourselves, feel good about happiness and bliss of that state, experience oneness to whatever extent we can, and then come back to the fragmented state of the object relations. So too much can lead to one group of psychosis with negative features but positive affect being the center of the affective life, or too little of it can lead to very strong addictions, sadism and masochism, stunted spiritual and artistic life, too much of greed, too much of exploitative nature, and a constant sense of dissatisfaction, chaos, and disintegration. Inability to experience bliss, freshness, happiness of the spiritual time. So these are the problems which can arise by too much or too little that happens in the state of primary narcissism. One argument can be, should primary narcissism be treated as a pre-oral stage, or should primary narcissism be treated as a part of the oral stage? Because if we look at 0 to 2 years, by that logic, primary narcissism should also be a part of the oral stage, the first part of the oral stage. Then why do we list it out separately? We list it out separately because oral stage essentially is a stage of object relations. It is a stage where the child is relating to the breast and the child is aware that he is relating to an object called the breast. I and not I are clearly established. The child is the I and the breast is the not I. So oral stage is not a pre-object stage. It is a post-object stage, whereas the primary narcissism is a pre-object stage, and therefore, although chronologically you can fit primary narcissism as the first part of the oral stage, but I have listed it before the oral stage. So we would have primary narcissism, then beginning of the object stage, and then the oral stage. But Freud doesn't go into that kind of distinction. So we just go from primary narcissism. Freud describes primary narcissism very clearly, contrary to Klein and the entire school of object relations. So after primary narcissism stage is over, in a few days or a few weeks, the oral stage starts. And in the oral stage, the primary mode of experiencing pleasure is through the oral apparatus. The lips, the mouth, the tongue, and so on. The entire oral apparatus becomes the center of focus of the child, and child derives pleasure largely from the oral apparatus. In case of primary narcissism, the libido is spread all over the body. The erotogenic zones have not yet become distinctly active. So the whole body is loaded with eros. The concentration of pleasure activity in certain zones of the body is still not active. Whereas in the oral stage, what happens is from the libido being spread out onto the whole body, it now gets concentrated. From the whole body, it gets concentrated. Large amount of libido is concentrated in the oral area, and some small amount is diffused across the body. So the largest concentration of libido of the pleasure activity is in the oral area. So this is called the oral stage. Oral stage essentially is a stage where the child gets milk for survival from the breast, and the act of sucking the milk is not only for survival, it is also for pleasure. So at times, even if the child does not want milk, it still wants to suck on the breast because of the pleasure. And at times, the child bites at the breast to express aggression. So the oral stage is a stage where survival is ensured by sucking milk from the oral apparatus. Aggression is expressed by the oral apparatus in an act of what we call oral rage, and pleasure is experienced by the act of sucking and touching the breast through this part. So it is a stage where nourishment is received, pleasure is derived, and aggression is expressed. And the oral stage happens in the 0 to 2 years of age. Now let us look at what happens in details in the oral stage. In the oral stage, if there is too much or too little pleasure, something can go wrong. Let us look at what can go wrong in the oral stage, which can lead to pathology. If the breast is not available when wanted, if the milk is not available when needed, the survival gets in danger. So the too little of milk or too little of pleasure, too little of availability of the breast leads to questions on one's survival, and this leads to catastrophic thinking and the fear of abandonment. So in the adult life, if we see catastrophic thinking and fear of abandonment at work, in Freudian terms, we can look back to the oral stage, that something must have happened not right in the oral stage, leading to development of catastrophic thinking and fear of abandonment. Similarly, if the sucking of the breast does not give adequate pleasure, or the breast is removed just after milk is given and pleasure is not allowed to the child, it can again lead to the same two difficulties: catastrophic thinking, abandonment, and the feeling that the world is not reliable. It leads to issues of trust versus mistrust. So if the breast is available too much, one develops too much of trust. If the breast is available too little, milk is available too little. So if milk and pleasure are available too little, a mistrust develops about the world, and catastrophic thinking and fear of abandonment starts. So the template developed there is the world is not a safe place. So issues of trust versus mistrust, the world is not a safe place, catastrophic thinking, fear of abandonment. All these issues occur in adult life when in the oral stage things have not gone right. One more phenomena that Freud talks about as an oral stage phenomena is the pathology of secondary narcissism. So Freud talks about two kinds of narcissism: primary narcissism and secondary narcissism. Primary narcissism, what we saw in the first slide. Secondary narcissism relates to a narcissism which is created in object relations. Primary narcissism is a pre-object phenomenon. Secondary narcissism is an oral stage phenomena where the child goes out with all his emotions to relate to the mother or the father or the caregiver. But his approach, his love is not reciprocated. And the child feels rejected, he feels frustrated, he feels intense frustration, pain, disappointment, rage, at times even shame, at times even guilt. And that painful frustration leads to a template in the child that it is painful to relate, I will not relate to anybody. It is painful to attempt to relate, it is painful to relate, I won't do it again, never again. This creates in child a false sense of self-sufficiency, because if the sense of self-sufficiency is not created, he would have to relate to somebody, and that is very risky, very painful. So a false sense of self-sufficiency is created by the child. The rejection also leads to extreme inferiority, against which child uses the defense of reaction formation, which we will do later, and child develops a superiority, a grandiosity. So when the child's advances towards the parent or the caregiver are not reciprocated, the child is frustrated, pained, and the child develops inferiority and pain because of vulnerability and dependence. And the child learns a lesson that it is not safe to relate, not safe to depend, not safe to be vulnerable, and not safe to feel confident. So the child feels inferiority, shame, pain, and to overcome this, what the child does is it develops a false sense of grandiosity. So the child overcomes the inferiority of rejection by grandiosity. The child overcomes the pain of vulnerability by self-sufficiency. The child overcomes uh, the pain by developing a slight high, a slight manic high. So the child creates a false position of grandiosity, of a false manic high, of self-sufficiency, of no need for the other, and of superiority, of omnipotence. And this position is called the position of secondary narcissism, and it's a disorder. It is the disorder of narcissism, and mostly when we say narcissism, we mean secondary narcissism. If we want to say primary narcissism, we have to specify primary narcissism. Uh, Conventionally, the word narcissism refers to secondary narcissism. So secondary narcissism is a disorder which develops what we call narcissism. In DSM, they call it narcissistic personality disorder, where there is a false sense of entitlement, false sense of grandiosity, false sense of self-sufficiency, a contempt for others, and a false preoccupation, not a false, but a pathological preoccupation with the grandiose and the perfect and the out of this world. So this can happen in this stage if the advances of the child towards the caregiver are rejected and not reciprocated by the caregiver. Oral stage also is a stage where the child expresses anger through the oral cavity by biting or by pushing the face against the breast or against the face. So, or by crying, by making sound out of the oral apparatus. So, if the child is allowed to express safely, then the child develops the capacity to express aggression safely. But if the aggression is muffled, repressed severely by the caregiver, then the child develops a template. It is not safe to express aggression. And then all the aggression is repressed inside, and then it turns on the child, on the person himself, leading to symptoms. So these are the problems which can occur in the oral stage. And the oral stage is 0 to 2 years. After the oral stage, we now come to the anal stage. So after the oral stage, the anal stage starts. So what happens is, in the oral stage, the concentration of pleasure activity is in the oral area. In the age group of 2 to 4, some people say 2 to 3.5, the anal apparatus becomes the center of pleasure activity. In the sense, the child starts focusing on that part as the toilet training starts, and as he starts taking more solid food, whereby the feces become more solid and intense sensations are felt in the anal area as the solid feces come out. So the anal stage is between 2 to 4 years. Let us look at the details of what can go wrong in the anal stage. The anal stage is a very important stage from point of view of development of pathology. Issues which are involved in the anal stage are: the first issue is of autonomy versus control. The child does not want to get toilet trained, and the parents want the child to get toilet trained. So the issue is of autonomy versus control. Too much of control can make the child dependent. Too much of autonomy can make him uh, completely averse to any sort of control. It can lead to a pathological avoidance of all authority. So the balance has to be there. Too much autonomy, too much control, both create problems. Domination versus submission is also an important theme of the anal stage. If the parents are too dominating, they make the child submissive. If the parents are too submissive, if the parents are too dominating, they make the child submissive. If the parents are too submissive, they make the child dominating. So a right balance has to be struck there. If it is not struck in the adult life, we see characteristics of too much of domination, of too much of submission in the adult, rooted in experiences of the anal stage where the templates were created first time in the life. Similarly, in autonomy versus control, the child is slowly asked to control the uh, coming out of feces, and the child struggles with muscular control. So if the child just cannot do it, it leads to a fear of one's capability and leads to extreme inferiority and shame that one is not able to do it. So in the toilet training, shame also can be a very important element. Inferiority also can be a very important element, and not the guilt of not measuring up to the expectation of the parent also can be an important element. Cleanliness versus dirt. Too much insistence on cleanliness can make you a cleanliness freak. Too loose a training can make you a completely uh, cleanliness agnostic person who is comfortable with dirt and things which are messy. So this also is a very important element, and we see this in obsessive compulsive disorders. Too much obsession with cleanliness or too much obsession with dirt. Order versus disorder. If the toilet training is too strict in the anal stage, if the parents are too insisting on keeping something at the right place or not disturbing something which has been kept at the right place and not to create disorder, the problem of order versus disorder in the adult life gets developed in the anal phase. Hoarding versus discarding. So in the anal stage, initially the child does not believe that the feces that he excretes is something to be discarded, something to be disgusted about, something to be saved oneself from about. The child feels it is something that he is creating, something which is coming out of the body. It is something which is a creation of the body, his creation. And therefore the child wants greedily to hoard it. But the parents tell another story that this is something unhygienic, something disgusting, and it has to be discarded. How harsh that is and how harsh it is taken by the mind of the child leads to whether the person is going to become as an adult somebody who hoards things. And if the hoarding problem arises, then people are into collecting things, collecting stamps, collecting flower pots, collecting clothes. But hoarding of any type is rooted in the hoarding of the feces that the child experiences in the anal phase. Similarly, too much stress on discarding leads to too much of discarding and not being able to collect even the optimum amount of collection one needs to be comfortable and to feel safe. And this often leads to not being able to tolerate a strong bank balance. That the moment a strong bank balance is built, it has to be used for expenses, and you have to reduce it down to a comfortable level. So inability to collect wealth can be because of too much of discarding in the anal stage. It can be because of other areas also, other reasons also. For example, it can also be because of a Kleinian reason that collection of good object is always going to be short-lived, and the good objects are going to go and then pain will follow. So better not to have too many good objects, better not to get attached to them. So that is a separate Kleinian explanation of discarding and hoarding based on object gain, object loss, and effects related to both of them. But the Freudian explanation is this: hoarding of species or discarding of feces. Too much or too strict training about it leads to adult problems of collecting useless things or not being comfortable when good things are accumulating, rightly so. One subtle example can be, you have a car, you give it to somebody, and when you don't feel like taking it back. That would be one subtle example of too much of discarding. And that can be entanglement of anal phenomena plus early life object relations phenomena. You can have a Freudian and Kleinian explanation working together to cause a phenomenon. Another anal problem is of sadism. Rage comes up during this stage partly naturally. We see children often killing insects in this stage or often showing aggression in this stage. And how it is dealt with is based upon, determines partly in association with the constitution of the child. How it is dealt with leads to sadism or masochism. Constitutional aggression can also lead to sadism apart from the behavior of the parents. If the parents allow the child to be sadist and give the child that leeway, it's easier for the child to become sadist. If the parents tutor the child out of sadism, it's easier for the child to come out of sadism. Similarly, masochism. If the child self-denies something, hurts himself, and then is treated well by parents, pain brings love is a template which is created, and that can lead to masochism. Too much of death instinct can also lead to masochism. Greed is also rooted in the anal stage. The greed is expressed by hoarding of the feces. Many times, many people have a dream of defecating, and that is, in Freudian anal terms, that is a dream of creativity, where one's creativity is stifled and one wants freedom to be creative. The production of feces is seen as a creative act in the anal stage. Before the child gets to learn, it's something disgusting. So greed is rooted, adult greed is rooted in the childhood anal phase and is related to the hoarding of feces. You don't want to let go of the good creation that you have done. You see it's something precious, a part of yourself. And you don't want to let go a part of yourself. And then the feces is substituted by money and the money becomes a part of yourself. You want to collect all parts of yourself to become a whole. And then it gets coupled with the drive for power, drive for pleasure, security, and so on. But one element of drive for money is the drive for greed, is the drive of greed. And that is related to the greed first experience in relation to the feces as a creative part one has created and put out of oneself. Repetition. Repeating the same thing is also an anal feature. And that has to do with constitutionally somehow the death instinct becomes stronger than in the oral stage, in the anal stage. There is a, if we analyze from life instinct, death instinct point of view, life instinct is very strong in the oral stage, and the death instinct starts making its appearance strongly in the anal phase, and then becomes either stronger or weaker in the edible phase. But in both cases, the appearance of death instinct in the anal and the edible phase is always more than in the oral phase, except for a few exceptions, of course, but generally it is more. So if we find any adult person with problems about autonomy or control, somebody who is a control freak, somebody who is a laissez-faire person, somebody too dominating or too submissive, somebody too clean or too dirty, too orderly or too disorderly, hoarding type or the discarding type, sadistic or masochistic, greedy or into repetitions. All of these adults have some problem rooted in the anal stage. So these problems of the anal stage lead to pathologies in the adult stage. Obsessive compulsive disorder is rooted in the anal stage. Sadism and masochism is rooted in the anal stage. Greed of collecting objects is rooted in the anal stage. Order versus disorder, and any disorder leading to anxiety is also rooted in the anal stage. So we come back to the psychosexual stages. We have seen the stage of primary narcissism, oral stage, anal stage. Now let us go to the phallic stage or the Oedipal stage. The phallic stage or the Oedipal stage as it is called, it's written Oedipal, red Oedipal. It is from 4 to 5 years of age. Some people say 4 to 7 years of age. Some people say 3.5 to 5 years of age. In fact, if we actually look at children, there is a fair amount of play in the date of onset and the date of termination of any stage. It is not a universal, absolute, accurate figure that 2 years is 2 years, not 2 years and 1 week or 2 years and 2 weeks. That kind of precision we don't see in onset or termination of any stage. So it's okay if we use this as indicative figures. It is called phallic or the Oedipal stage because of reasons. Let us look at the words phallic and Oedipal. Phallic relates to the sexual organ, and Oedipal relates to the myth of Oedipus. Let us look at what they mean. Phallic means that the erotogenic zone, which is most prominent and active in this period of 4 to 5 years, is essentially the phallic area or the sexual organ area. It is the sexual organ area which is the zone with highest concentration of pleasurable activities in this period of 4 to 5 years of age. And therefore, this stage, when the erotogenic zone most active, is the zone of the sexual organ, and therefore this stage is called the phallic stage. It is also called the Oedipal stage because in this stage the child develops a romantic and sexual liking towards parent of the opposite gender and an anger towards the parent of the same gender, because the parent of the same gender is standing in the way, not allowing the child to have the parent of the opposite gender. And this triangle, where the child wants the parent of the opposite gender and has anger towards the parent of the same gender. The anger is so high that the child actually has a death wish for the parent of the same gender. This triangle is called the Oedipal triangle, based on the story of Oedipus. There is the myth of Oedipus in Greek mythology, where the story is there was a king in whose family a child was born, and the oracle said this child will grow up, kill his own father and marry his own mother. And the king was aghast hearing to this prediction. So the king asked his servants, soldiers, to kill the child. So the soldiers took the child to the forest, and then they felt compassionate towards the child. They did not want to kill the child. So what they did was they went to the border of the kingdom, crossed the border, and put the child on the other side of the border and came back and reported that the child had been killed. On the other side, the king did not have a child, and the king had come for hunting in the forest, and the king did not have a child. When the king saw this child, he thought God had given him a child. So the king took the child, declared him to be the prince, and everything went on. The child grew up as a prince, the king died, the child became the king. After that, the child who had become a king, he wanted to expand his kingdom, so he attacked the kingdom of his father, not knowing it was kingdom of his father. In that battle, he killed his father. Of course, he did not know he was his father. And as was the custom of those days, he married all the queens of the king he had killed. After some time, the oracle came back, and the oracle told him about the story. And he was filled with guilt and shame about what he had done. So as an act of atonement, Oedipus left his kingdom, went to the forest, he blinded himself and lived the last days of in the forest, working for atonement of the sins he had committed. So this is the Greek myth, and Freud used this Greek myth to coin a name for this psychosexual stage and called it the Oedipal stage. Because in this stage, the child develops desire for the parent of the same gender, for the parent of the opposite gender, and a death wish for the parent of the same gender, exactly like in the myth of Oedipus. Of course, in the myth of Oedipus, Oedipus did it not knowing it, whereas here the child is doing it knowingly, not doing it, thinking it. And the thought can be unconscious, it need not be conscious. So in the Oedipal phase, there is a desire for the parent of the opposite gender, aggression towards the parent of the same gender who is seen as authority figure, and then there is a fear, intense fear that the parent of the same gender will come to know about what is in the mind of the child. And if the parent knows about it, of the same gender knows about it, the parent will mutilate, torture, castrate, and kill the child. And this leads to extreme anxiety called the castration anxiety. And the castration anxiety can be intense. The intensity of castration anxiety is based upon the constitution of the child and how sadistic the child has been in fantasy in killing the parent, and how harsh parents have been in real life. All that determines the intensity of castration anxiety. But very soon the child realizes this anxiety and consequent feeling of negative effect, all sorts of negative effects. The child also feels guilt about having such desires and guilt for having such aggression towards the parent of the same gender. And this creates a very difficult state for a child of a state of anxiety, of guilt, and the child doesn't want to be in that state, wants to get out of it, and the child gets out of that state by what is called the resolution of the Oedipus complex. And the resolution is, okay, so first, why does the child want to resolve? The child wants to resolve because it's a survival problem. It's a problem of unbearable anxiety and unbearable guilt. So the child wants to get out of it by resolving the Oedipal desire. And the resolution is the child decides to give up the desire for the parent of the opposite gender and give up also the aggression towards the parent of the same gender and decide to be like the parent of the same gender, so that when he grows up, he can search for somebody like the parent of the opposite gender. So the boy tries to become like the father so that he can have in his adult age a woman who resembles the mother in some way, and vice versa for the daughter. So this is the resolution of the Oedipus complex. If the Oedipus complex cannot be resolved, either because the desire is too strong to be given up, aggression is too strong to be given up, guilt is not adequately strong, the parent figure of desire is too good to be given up, the parent of the same gender is too bad not to be proceeded in rage towards, or before the Oedipal phase starts, if the paranoid schizoid position is not resolved, what it is, we'll look at it later when we do Klein, but that also is one of the reasons why the Oedipal stage for many children is not resolved. So what are the reasons for not resolving the Oedipal stage? If the desire is, if the object of desire is too good, if the object of aggression is too bad, if constitutional strength of desire is too high, if constitutional strength of guilt is too low. Actually, we should not be talking of guilt here, because in the Freudian scheme of things, in the Kleinian scheme of things, the guilt is there, but in the Freudian scheme of things, guilt is not present till the resolution of Oedipus complex. And it is only in the resolution of Oedipus complex that guilt makes its appearance for the first time. So if I give only Freudian explanation, of why Oedipus complex is not resolved for some, then the explanation would be this. Very the object of desire being too good cannot be given a. Object of aggression being too bad, aggression cannot be given a. If this is the case, then you don't give up the object, and if you don't give up the object, the castration anxiety continues. If you partially resolve, there is a partial resolution also which takes place in most people, that partially it is resolved. What happens is that partially, if it's completely unresolved, problems are in the extreme, but most cases it's partial resolution, not complete resolution, and in some cases complete resolution. So what happens in case of partial and incomplete resolution and no resolution at all? Because the object of desire cannot be given up, the death wish and aggression towards the authority figure of the same gender continues, and therefore the fear of attack from the same person also continues. If it is given up successfully, then one has to endure the pain of loss of giving up. And one has to admit a new feeling guilt that it is wrong to do this. So that the once resolved Oedipus complex does not come up again. So one develops a sense of guilt that it is wrong to have it. So the guilt is the hair of Oedipus complex in Freud's words. So guilt develops at the end of Oedipus complex. It is developed by the mind, right? So that the Oedipus complex is never reopened again in the same way. And one feels bad that the Oedipus complex led to such feelings which are unacceptable. This guilt can also be developed after some time period passes by, and there can be a retrospective application of guilt. In some cases, it may also be that the Oedipus complex is resolved and that does not lead to guilt. It's a very utilitarian resolution. But later on, the child learns that this is immoral, unacceptable, and therefore one should feel guilty about it. The capacity for guilt develops, and a retrospective application of guilt is done onto the Oedipus complex and the events in the Oedipus stage, Oedipal stage. So this is what the Oedipus complex is all about. That, and this is, we are talking about a heterosexual constitution. That in a heterosexual constitution, the child has desire for parent of the opposite gender, death wish for the parent of the same gender, fear that the parent of the same gender will castrate, mutilate, torture, and kill. To resolve this anxiety and ensure survival, one decides to resolve the Oedipus complex, and it is a painful process to give up the object of desire, but one undergoes the pain, gives up the object of desire, gives up aggression towards the authority figure of the same gender, decides to be like the authority figure of the same gender oneself, so that later on in life one can have somebody like the object of desire. After the resolution, one also develops the capacity of guilt, and one applies it mostly retrospectively in order to fortify the resolution. And how quickly one learns also depends on the environment. Now, if the Oedipus complex is resolved satisfactorily, then what happens? And if not, okay, before that, what happens to homosexual and bisexual constitutions? In bisexual constitution, the desire would be towards parents of both the genders, aggression would be towards parents of both the genders, and resolution would include partly giving up desire of both the genders, parents of both the genders. In homosexual constitution, the desire would be for the parent of the same gender, aggression would be towards the parent of the opposite gender, fear from the parent of the opposite gender. So Oedipus is equally applicable to all the sexual orientations, heterosexual, bisexual and homosexual. If resolved satisfactorily, it leads to confidence, ability to take initiative and enterprising nature in adults. It leads to ability to work in triangles, squares and in complicated groups of many people. It leads to cordial and pleasant relationships with authority figures. It leads to a very good and healthy romantic and sexual life. However, if the Oedipal stage is not successfully resolved, then it can lead to variety of problems, which includes too much fear of authority figures, low confidence, a sense of shame and defeat, inability to take initiative, inability to be enterprising, difficulty of working in social triangles, social squares and larger social groups, very difficult to work with authority figures, particularly boss at the workplace or teacher at the college or principal at the college, too much of fear of the authority figure and therefore avoidance of the authority figure, anger towards the authority figure, at times defiance of the authority figure, and that creates 100 problems in personal life and professional life. It can also lead to pathological problems like erectile dysfunction, generalized anxiety disorder, in some cases it can lead to obsessive compulsive disorder. How that is, we will take in the next presentation, how something is rooted in the Oedipus complex, these pathologies. But for the moment, just make a note of it, that if it is not successfully resolved, it can lead to excessive fear of authority figures, lack of confidence, initiative, enterprise, impaired interpersonal and social relationships of managing in triangles, squares and larger groups, pathologies like generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. In obsessive compulsive disorder, both difficulty of Oedipal phase and anal phase, they play a part. It can lead to sexual problems of erectile dysfunction. It can lead to relationship problems of closeness. In some cases, it can also be at the root of depression. So a variety of problems in normal life and a variety of pathological, psychological disorders can be created if the Oedipal stage is not successfully resolved. After the phallic or Oedipal phase, 4 to 5 years, there comes a latency stage, 5 to 12 years, and a genital stage after 12 years. But most books, they talk only, when they talk of psychosexual stages, they talk only of 3 stages, oral, anal and phallic. But let us take a look in short at other 2 stages also. Latency period 5 to 12 years. Some people say 7 to 12 years. Some people say 7 to 14 years. Latency period, as the name suggests, is a period where whatever be the problems of the first 5 years of psychosexual development. So 0 to 5 years, you can say the period of psychosexual development. We should not say that actually because psychosexual stages are continuing, but this is how ordinarily people look at it. So let us say it this way: whatever problems are unresolved in the period of 0 to 5 years, they are all put a lid upon, put aside, and the focus of the system shifts on development of the body, on learning, academics, on sports, on friends and social groups. So the focus shifts completely, and all the unresolved problem of the first 5 years are put in a box, and the box is put aside. This is the period of latency, from 5 years to 14 years, and we can see how much energy children have in the latent period, and how quickly the body develops, how quickly learning happens in the latent period, latency period. If, however, for some child, the unresolved problems cannot be put into a box and the box cannot be put away, and in the so-called latency period also, some psychopathological problem starts where you cannot put a lid upon it, that is a very bad prognosis, because either the problem is too intense or the capability of the system to put a lid on the problem and put it aside is very weak. So too strong a problem or too weak a ego strength is bad prognosis. But in most cases, the latency period is a latency period, and all the unresolved problems are put in a box and the box is put aside. Till puberty. At puberty, 12 or 14 years of age, the genital phase starts. And the hormonal changes happen in the body, and the person becomes sexually active, capable person. And a proto-adulthood starts. So with puberty, a proto-adulthood starts, one becomes sexually active, hormonally one becomes very active, and what happens is the problems which were put aside in a box, they come back. The unresolved problem of the first 5 years which were put aside in the latency period, they come back and they open up and make their presence felt with renewed power in this period. And that is why the period of puberty is the period where 50 to 60% of chronic pathology starts. If you look at a person who is 32, 35, who is suffering from chronic depression, chronic anxiety for 10, 15 years, and if you ask him when did he start, most of them, 50 to 60% will say it started in puberty. In fact, it started in the first 5 years, but it was put aside in a box in latency period. And in puberty, all those unresolved packets, they open up with renewed vigor and power. So, in the genital phase, unresolved problems resurface with enhanced vigor, and 50 to 60% of any chronic pathology will have its roots, will have the beginning, the appearance of the first symptom usually in puberty at the beginning of the genital phase, and the roots of course would be in the first 5 years of psychosexual development. The genital period is also a period where on the healthy side, all the component instincts that come together under the overall control of the adult sexuality. It is also a period of experiencing one's adulthood in a proto way, slowly developing one's distinct identity, separating from parents and family, going in for individuation, seeking out partners, seeking out groups, developing idea of professional ambitions, and preparing oneself academically and otherwise to meet the world. So this genital phase that starts from 12 to 14 and goes lifelong. Okay? But the most important part is 12 to 18, after which the real adulthood slowly starts. So Freud doesn't talk much about latency period or the genital period. But this is important, that there is a healthy side to the genital period, like there is a healthy side to every period. Every stage has a healthy side. And if something does not go right, problems can arise. So genital phase is, of course, a phase where if things don't go right because of the way the parents are or environment is or the constitution is, one can develop problems of separating from the parents, individuating, seeking the right partner, developing the right ambition, preparing to meet the world. The preparing spelling is wrong, that needs a correction. Preparing to meet the world. But the more important part, so these are adult rational parts which can develop as problems, and they would more likely develop as problems if something to provide roots to those problems is there in the first 5 years. But the core issue is this: all the unresolved problems of first 5 years will resurface with enhanced power and vigor in the genital phase. So this is how we look at the psychosexual stages. These are the psychosexual stages. Stage of primary narcissism, birth to a few days or a few weeks. Oral stage, after the stage of primary narcissism till about 2 years. Anal stage 2 to 4 years or 3.5 years. Different people give different numbers. Phallic phase 3.5 to 5 or 4 to 5 or 4 to 7. Latency period 5 to 12 or 5 to 14. Genital stage 12 onwards or 14 onwards. In each stage, if things go right, certain strong parts of the personality are developed. If things go wrong, they become the roots for pathology. And in different stages, therefore, different psychological disorders are rooted from a Freudian standpoint. In subsequent presentations, we will see 12 different psychological disorders and how Freudian explanation is given about the causation of those 12 psychological disorders, most common disorders like anxiety, depression, and so on. So we take up 12 most common psychological disorders and we give Freudian explanation of what causes those disorders, and the explanation is rooted in the knowledge of the psychosexual stages that we have done today. So that we will see in the subsequent discussion. Thank you, and if you have any questions, write to me at hvindia@gmail.com.